So I'd like to call something out this morning that maybe you have heard me say before, or maybe not if you're sort of new. I can guarantee that at one time or another, if you've spent any time in the Bible, you have thought this thing at least once, if not many times. But maybe because of your upbringing and what was allowed and not allowed, maybe you weren't really allowed to say it out loud. So I'm just going to say it for you, okay? The Bible is super weird. Like really, really strange, right? If we're honest about it, as you read through it and pick your way through it, and as you study it, and maybe even as you do cursory readings of different passages in it, it is bizarre. It's so strange. And sometimes it's confounding and confusing. Sometimes it's beautiful and artistic. Sometimes it makes a lot of sense, and sometimes it makes no sense. And sometimes the very thing that made sense to you yesterday, you will reread today and have no idea what it is supposed to say to you today. It's a wild and strange and extremely weird book. Now, I feel like I should clarify something since some of your moms listen to our sermon podcast in order to keep up with you and make sure that you're doing the right thing. I don't want you to get any flack from them. I am no less fascinated by, no less moved by, and no less curious about the Bible, having admitted that I find it to be very, very strange. In fact, my honesty with the Bible and my honesty with sort of the Christian tradition in general has allowed me to approach it in a way that feels like it's more useful in my life than it ever has been. And I hope that as you get more and more honest about the Bible and more honest about faith and Christianity, that you'll also find it to be more useful and more real and more raw and more specific to your current stage and station in life. We're about to start a series today in the book of Amos. And I suspect that some of you have read the book of Amos, and some of you have read it a very long time ago, but you have not read it recently. Some of you have never heard of the book of Amos. Some of you started Amos and got real weirded out, and you stopped reading Amos. That's okay. I'm not going to ask you where you're at on Amos. But I want you to know that we're going to do the best we possibly can to help the book of Amos be accessible to you no matter where you are in your faith journey. The person to your right and the person to your left likely have a different relationship with the Bible than you do. Our sort of the diversity in our church from a theological and philosophical perspective is vast, and it's one of my favorite things about our church. And so my hope is that we can teach through the book of Amos in a way that helps those of you who absolutely love the Bible and you can't get enough of it and you want more and more of it, that you develop a yearning and a curiosity for it to go out. It sort of whets your appetite to learn more about it on your own. And for those of you where the Bible has been used to harm you, it has been used to cause pain in your life, that this will feel like a safe way to re-enter some of these texts. I know that some of you have been through a lot of pain in the church, and I want you to know that I'm very sorry for that, and I'm sorry for the way that the Bible has been used to bring about that pain. But I think that there is a tremendous amount of light and life in these ancient texts, and I hope that it can be presented that way to you throughout the rest of this series. Studying the Old Testament, particularly Mind Prophet, requires, I think, some helpful recognitions about the lenses that we take when we look into something like the book of Amos. And I want you to consider these things really quickly. First is this: you already have an interpretive lens. You already have a hermeneutic or a way in which you see a Bible text, or the way in which you see your neighbor or a coworker or a friendship or someone in your family. You already have an interpretive lens on the world, and that is applied to biblical texts, okay? So this idea that somehow you can set aside this lens that you have for every other domain and area of life and not utilize that when you're reading the Bible is just silliness. You have an interpretive lens. Second, with some intentionality, if you want to, you can shift your lens to fit a particular set of values. You can do that. You can decide, I'm going to read the text in this particular way. Now, some people try to do that, and they say, I'm going to have a particular lens for the way I read all of the Bible, and I don't recommend that. The Bible is a vast array of different genres and authors, and I think that each one should be approached with something a little bit different. But you can do that if you want to. And I'm going to share a little bit of my interpretive lens for the Bible in a minute, and you're welcome to just take it. You can steal it. You can use it for yourself. Or you can develop another one for yourself if you'd like. And third is this. There's more than one right way to interpret the Bible. And I know that there's probably some voice in the back of your head, maybe based on your upbringing or a recent experience, that's saying, that's a slippery slope, man. I don't know. There really should only be one way to do this. But I can tell you this for sure. There's more than one right way to interpret these texts to fit the stage and station of your life. I believe that. And what that means is that you are allowed to, and even welcome to, change your mind. There are things that I believe about the Bible and my faith that I did not believe 10 years ago. And I suspect that 10 years from now, things will look a little different for me. It's okay to change your mind because there's more than one way to look at these texts. So, Amos specifically, here's some things that I want you to consider just for your own interpretation. History and geography are extremely important, okay? So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of where this was happening and when this was happening and sort of what some of the things that were happening surrounding it, because I want you to be able to put yourself in the story as much as you possibly can. Second is this. Amos was not written to you or the prophecy spoken to you, okay? This is literally an ancient text. Sometimes we throw that word around when we talk about the Bible. This is like actually an ancient text. It is super duper old, okay? That's the measurement we're using, super duper old. Very, very ancient. And it wasn't spoken to you. Amos didn't show up here to speak these words to you, and whoever recorded them, maybe it was Amos, maybe it was somebody else, whoever recorded them they did not have you in mind. I know that maybe your background's like you're number one, but this isn't about you. That doesn't mean there's nothing for you in this text. I think there's a lot for you, but it's not about you or to you specifically. Here's a question that I want you to keep in mind, and I think that this is a helpful interpretive lens really for lots of different texts in the Bible. Keep your eye out for the answer to this question. What does this say about the character of God? We tend to approach the Bible as an instruction manual, and we think, I can develop a behavioral model off of whatever I'm reading because of the way that the people in the text are behaving or because of who the author or how the author is telling these people to behave. And we think of it as a way of developing a behavioral model. And in doing so, we put the cart before the horse because the Bible is simply the revelation of God. God is revealing himself to us through these texts. And so the first question we should be answering is, what do I know about God from reading this that I didn't know before? Or what is reinforced about God in this text that I did know before, but maybe I had forgotten, or it sort of became less important to me for some reason. And then you can extrapolate a behavioral model from that thing, but it starts there. What is this telling me about who God is? Fourth, take the book of Amos and the text that we go through with a grain of salt. They're really, really important. And they're also not meant to stand alone. The Bible is this wild and crazy, convoluted kind of mess that we get to navigate together. That's what it means to be the church. But no one book or particular text was meant to stand alone. And so it's not going to be comprehensive in what it tells you. So take it with a grain of salt. And lastly, just as a warning, prophecy is poetic. And so whenever you read through these prophecies, you're going to see some of the literary devices that are used in poetry, and that can feel kind of confusing if you're not ready for that. You're going to see rhyme and meter, you're going to see repetition, you're going to see metaphor and other literary devices that create imagery in your mind, and they're meant to call together in your mind some sort of curiosity to stoke your imagination. It's meant to be part art and part teaching. And so it's going to come across in a way that maybe is a little bit strange to you. Just remember that prophecy is oftentimes poetic. So let's jump into the book of Amos. Amos chapter 1, verse 1, tells us a lot about the geography and history of this particular person. It goes like this: the words of Amos, one of the shepherds of Tekoa, the vision he saw concerning Israel 2 years before the earthquake, when Uzziah was king of Judah and Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, was king of Israel. So who is Amos? Well, it tells us right there at the very beginning that Amos was a shepherd, which at that time was basically like saying he was just sort of a regular dude. That was a very regular profession. That was a very normal thing to be doing. We think of shepherds or farmers or ranchers now as people who sort of raise cattle and then they sell that cattle and that's how they make a living. This probably was more like a subsistence situation. It was likely that he was in charge of the sheep or whatever cattle that he had for his family, for their estate, and they utilized the cattle that they were raising. Now, occasionally they may sell a sheep or sell some wool or whatever they had, but he wouldn't collect a paycheck per se. It would just kind of go into the family estate. And then the family would use that in order to take care of themselves. It was a very simple way of living, and it was a very standard profession at the time. The reason why the author puts this at the beginning is to remind us that Amos was unique as a prophet. Sometimes prophets would have this like vision from God, and they would just sort of like burn everything down and go to that people and say all the things that God wanted them to say, and they just sort of like cut ties with every part of their life. It is very likely that Amos left his job as a shepherd to someone else for a while and then returned immediately back to it after he had delivered this prophecy. The book of Amos is about a man who was a very regular person. But he wasn't a disembodied person that didn't have a place. You see, you have a place. It's like your neighborhood or maybe your job or maybe it's here. But there's something that you're rooted to, some sort of ground or earth or soil that you're rooted to. And I think it's helpful to see a little bit about where Amos was from. Where was he when he received this vision and delivered this prophecy? I read this in a scholarly paper. It says, ancient Tekoa lies high in the Judean mountains, 756 meters above sea level, about 5 miles south and southeast of Bethlehem and about 10 miles south of Jerusalem. Did we get the map up there? Is that possible? Incredible. Amazing people back there. That's a shot. So you can see Bethlehem, you can see Jerusalem, you can see the Dead Sea, and you can kind of see where Tekoa is in relation to that. It would have been somewhat rural compared to those other places that I just mentioned. When was this prophecy delivered? Well, I find that the history and the timing, the chronology of this to be actually really interesting and I think really pertinent. This was delivered during a time when the people of God were divided into the monarchy of Israel and Judah before there was any exile. This divided kingdom is a very important part of Israel's history. The division took place sometime around the death of King Solomon. At that time, 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel refused to submit to Solomon's son, Rehoboam, and revolted against the two that did. And they formed two kingdoms, one in the north, Israel, and one in the south, Judah. So there's this massive division in the people of God. And in that division, those two kingdoms that were formed were desperately weakened. They were hurting real bad. And there's a whole lesson in there that we won't get into today about how division weakens and about how division makes things very problematic for everyone. And in their division, both kingdoms became fairly weak. And later on in their history, 722 BCE, to be more specific, the 10 tribes in the north were overtaken by the Assyrians, and not too long after that, the 2 tribes in the south were overtaken by the Babylonians. The 10 tribes in the north of Israel were actually referred to later on in many different places as sort of like the lost tribes or the 10 lost tribes of Israel, because they were never really repatriated. They were never really reformed. They just kind of disappeared. They sort of just dissolved into the nations that brought them in. They assimilated almost so completely that they just lost their identity. But the kingdoms in the south, the kingdoms that were enslaved by the Babylonians, they were eventually, by King Cyrus, a different king that took them into captivity, they were repatriated and they were given land and they were given resources. Cyrus did not enslave them. Cyrus was not the perpetrator of enslavement, and yet takes part in what is perhaps the greatest act of reparation from a government standard that the world had ever seen. Repatriating these people and giving them the resources that they need to rebuild and to have a life, to have success, and to thrive. And this is where we have the nation of Judah, the people of Israel as they remained, who continued on after that point. But at the time that this prophecy was spoken, the division had taken place, but this enslavement had not yet come about. There's a few questions I want you to consider before we jump into the actual text here. In general, when reading a minor prophet, these can be really helpful. First, what is the root of their intensity? Ask yourself this when you're reading through a minor prophet. You're going to notice when you're reading through minor prophets, particularly Amos, you're like, man, these guys are intense. Like, wow. They just, there's like a fire in their belly, and I'm not so sure I'm like very comfortable with it. What is the root of their intensity? Dig into that a little bit. You might be uncomfortable with it at first, but dig into that question. What is the root of their intensity? Second, what part of God's character has been violated by the recipient of the prophecy? Usually they're there because some characteristic of God or some value that God holds to has been violated in some way, and the prophet is there to tell them, those people, of that, and to inform them. The third question, which is similar to the second one, and they might be the same answer, what part of God's character is the prophet highlighting or restoring? The whole purpose of a prophecy is that the people return to God, that they restored in that characteristic that they had previously violated. And then lastly, what behavioral models can I derive or extrapolate from the characteristic of God that the prophet is communicating? Okay, so some of this is repeat from before, but these are good, helpful lenses. Let's jump into chapter 1. I'm going to try to cover the first 3 chapters really quick. Hang tight. Chapter 1. Amos essentially in this particular chapter is eviscerating 6 Gentile or non-Jewish nations for the injustices they have allowed or perpetrated themselves. They took others captives, they oppressed the poor, they were money and power hungry, they were unbecoming of the people who carried God's image as a part of God's divine creation. Now, these are people who are not Jewish, they're not given God's law, and yet God holds them to a particular moral standard. Because he holds this all people to this particular moral standard. It says this, starting in verse 6, "For 3 sins of Gaza, even for 4, I will not relent, because she took captive whole communities and sold them to Edom. I will send fire on the walls of Gaza that will consume her fortresses. I will destroy the king of Ashdod and the one who holds the scepter of Ascalon. I will turn my hand against Ekron until the last of the Philistines are dead, says the sovereign Lord." Now, a few things I want to note on that. You're going to see, first of all, this structure patterned throughout the entire first and second chapter of the book of Amos. So this whole structure is patterned multiple times, 6 times, particularly in this first chapter, and it looks the same every time, but the names are different. So first it says 3 sins, even 4. It's a literary mechanism that means that they are filled with sin. So 3 being a complete number, they're sort of like completed in their sinfulness, and they get a bonus one because there's a 4th sin. So it's like they're really sinful is sort of the point that he's trying to make, and he's using a repetition of a particular literary device to show us that. So they're like super duper sinful, super duper old text, super duper sinful people. What was their sin? Well, they enslaved and trafficked entire communities. They enslaved people, brought them into their captivity, and then they sold those people, entire communities, to other nations. And so what is God going to do about it? Well, he's going to cause their physical structures to fall and to be useless. He's going to dethrone their rulers, and he's going to withhold resources and blessing until these groups are totally wiped out. Some people read that text until the last Philistines are dead, as though God is going to, with his very own hand, kill them. But usually when it says that I will turn my hand against them, what it means is I will no longer bless them and allow them to succeed. So I'm just going to sort of cut off any blessing and resource that I was giving to them, and they will eventually just dissipate as a people. They'll eventually just they'll either be acquired by another people and they'll assimilate and disappear in that way, or they will just literally die off. That's the way that I think it is probably best interpreted. This prophecy isn't against Israel. It's against Israel's neighbors. They have violated a law. They have not violated the law per se. They have violated a law that is written on our hearts as people made in the image of God, and that is that human beings are to be valued and given value in every single situation, regardless of whether or not they fall into this particular category as the people of God or not. This is a basic standard that God holds all people to, and so he sends one of his prophets to tell these people who really had not really considered much of what Yahweh had to say it's going to go very bad for you because you've violated a law about humanizing other people. You enslaved them, and then you trafficked them, and you did so for profit because you devalued them as people, and that violates a core law that God has written onto all of our hearts. Chapter 2. Now Amos now turns to his own kingdom and the kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. to prophesy about their disobedience to God's law and character. So now it's more specific to the law itself, but also to the character of God more broadly. Starts again here in verse 6 of chapter 2. For 3 sins of Israel, even for 4, I will not relent. They sell the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They trampled on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground and denied justice to the oppressed. Father and son use the same girl and so profane the holy name, my holy name. They lie down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. In the house of their God, they drink wine taken as fines. Again, you see that same familiar pattern for 3 sins of Israel and even 4. This is now applied to the people of God who have been given the law. So again, these people are super duper sinful. That was the point that he's making. But again, for the sin of what? The sin of the sale of other human beings, the dehumanization of other people. The people of God were not immune to this at all. They had taken part in this exact same thing. They enslaved and sold other human beings for profit and for gain. They also created an economic and social system wherein the poor remained poor and perhaps got even poorer. The society takes advantage of the poor, and instead of giving them resources to survive and even thrive, they are pushed down even further than they were before. They are trampled upon, is what the text says. When people seek out justice, perhaps some of these same poor people who are being pushed down, when they seek justice, they are denied the justice system. They're not even allowed to participate. They're cut off completely. There's no due process. There's nothing for them to gain the thing that they want. And then towards the second half of that text, we see what falls into the category of sexual sin, and that father and son are sleeping with the same girl. The word girl is used there, not woman, so it's likely that by their standards that she is a minor. She is used. She is not just slept with. There's no consent or love or anything beautiful in this. This is the use of another person to gain power and authority, and God is enraged. He will not have it. And so he sends somebody to say, you can't continue to dehumanize other people. You can't continue to take captive other human beings, whether it's one single person or an entire community, and then sell them or use them or whatever you're going to do with them in order to gain authority, power, money, whatever it is that you're looking to gain. I'm not going to let it happen anymore, and I'm going to cut it off at the source. And in chapter 3, we start to see how God is going to do that and what he is going to do to his people. Starting in verse 1, it says, hear this, people of Israel, the Lord has spoken against you, against the whole family I brought up out of Egypt. You only have I chosen of all the families of earth. Therefore I will punish you for all your sins. There's 2 things I want you to notice here. First, Amos reminds them that God brought them out of Egypt. This is extremely important, both as a motif throughout all of the scriptures, God constantly reminding his people, I brought you out of Egypt, I brought you out of slavery. But there is some literary irony here in that God is saying, I freed you from slavery and now you're enslaving. You're not just violating this thing that I wrote into the law and wrote on your heart as a human being. You're violating something that I liberated you from. You're doing the very thing that I freed you from. The second thing that happens in this text is that God reminds them that you are chosen and therefore I will punish you. What an interesting correlation, right? It draws a direct correlation in one phrase, using the word therefore as a conjunction. You are my chosen people who I love, and therefore I'm going to punish you. And we sort of bristle at that word punishment, right? And some of you are like, I don't know where this is going, because we don't like that idea that a God just lashes out to punish us. That God lashes out and just sort of we think for some reason when we think of the word punish, we think of sort of this irrational just sort of rage, right? You might think of an abusive parent or even just a parent who loses their temper, or a boss who sends that passive-aggressive email, or somebody in your life who decides that in order to harm you for the thing that you've done or left undone, that they're going to cause you some kind of pain, and they're going to do so in a way that's manipulative, or they're going to do so in a way that's not controlled or structured. But the text here tells us something different. Digging a little bit deeper, what we are reminded of is that the people of God were adopted into God's family. Chosen by him because of his deep, deep love for them. And so more than punishment here, what we see is correction. You know, the moments that I have with my dad that I think are most meaningful and that stick out in my mind are the times where he was giving me great advice. And it doesn't happen all the time, right? I mean, part of it's because I'm his kid, and so like, ironically, he's like not the person that I want to listen to, right? You know, isn't that weird? Like the people in our life that have the most to tell us are oftentimes the people that we want to listen to the least. But there have been moments that stand out in my memory where my dad just gave me great advice. It was correction. It was discipline in some way. You might even call it some form of punishment to try to help steer me in the right direction. I had maybe moved away from a system of values that he had given me or presented to me, and he was correcting me back into what I was designed for and what I was aiming for. The people of God, and this is a part that I think is not to you, but very much for you, are chosen and adopted into God's family because of his deep and abiding love for them. And because of that, therefore, he will correct you. Therefore, he will move you back in line with the things that he's written on your heart as a human being and that he's given to you in some sort of a moral law or the law itself or whatever you'd like to put there. He's given you something to align yourself with, and it is likely that there have been times in your life that you have strayed from that thing. Again, the character of God, vast, complex. It's a million things we could highlight. We highlighted one in particular from this text. You may not resonate with it because we were talking about enslaving and selling other people. But it's likely that there has been a characteristic of God or a part of who God is that you've moved away from, strayed from, and he's called you back to that. One of my favorite things to do with my kids, most of you know that the majority of my kids are adopted, is to make up bedtime stories about how we adopted them, and they're wildly embellished, and most of it's not true. And they know that, like they giggle at it, and it's different every time, right? It's like a fairy tale that I make up every time about how, like, mom and dad like kind of swooped in and like we picked them specifically and they became a part of our family, and really it was just a ton of bureaucracy in the foster care system. That's how they came, but it's just less fun that way. And I talk to them all the time about how I chose them. Because my love for them was immediate. And therefore, I correct them. And therefore, I discipline them. And I discipline them because I love them. And I love them more than anyone else. I know that, and lots of you have taken care of my kids. Like, people take care of my kids all the time. The people who take care of my kids do not discipline them nearly as often or as harshly as I do. And I would also wager that the people who take care of my kids do not love my kids as deeply as I do. I would step in front of a train or take a bullet from any one of my kids. And because of that, I correct them. I try to put them back on the track that leads them to love their neighbor, that leads them to selflessness, that leads them towards liberation, because that is the thing that God did for his people and continues to do. Discipline or shaping our kids, or shaping us as God's kids, oftentimes looks a lot more like advice than punishment, because love is the main motivator. God loves you deeply. And because of that, God will correct you and steer you and move you into a life that is more aligned with his character. And this is what we're going to see more and more played out in the book of Amos over the next couple of weeks. Here's some things for you to think about just in the coming days between now and next Sunday. First, here's a question. What characteristics of God are revealed in the text that we covered? Or whatever text you read in the book of Amos. Like, again, answer that question. What are we seeing about God? And make a list of those things, or maybe meditate on them a little bit. Second, what behaviors or practices can I derive or extrapolate from those characteristics? For instance, if you feel compelled for whatever reason in this text or another text to focus on God's forgiveness, how can you practice or develop a practice of forgiveness? What about liberation? This is the thing that I think God makes very clear. I'm a liberator. You are a liberated people. You continue to enslave and sell. You've violated my characteristic of liberation. How do you and I develop a practice of liberation in our lives? And lastly, what are some ways that God might be lovingly disciplining you, shaping you, correcting you, steering you, advising you to be more aligned with his character? Would you pray with me? God, thank you for the prophet Amos, this sort of unexpected shepherd who was given such a massive task. Thank you that was recorded. It blows my mind that it was recorded and that we have this text available to us to learn from, to gain from, to draw from. I pray, God, that these ancient texts, although they have been used to do so much harm over the years, may they be, as they are exposed and expounded on, may they be sources of life and light to us. We love you, Lord, and we pray these things in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.